All right, welcome back everybody to Grasshopper Fundamentals. In this video, we're going to do a basic overview of how components work and how to operate them. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through, we're going to talk about the components up here in these menus. We're just going to kind of cover generally how these categories are working. We're also going to talk about the component themselves. We're going to talk about the menus that we're going to find in the main part of the components and in the center part of the components. These are the right-click menus, and they're a little bit different depending on which component you're selecting. We're also going to talk about different types of data streams. We have different data types that are going between different components, and it's really important to be aware of those different types of data. And we're also going to talk about what these warning flags are. Okay, we have a few different flag types. Okay, so in one of the previous videos, I talked kind of conceptually about how inputs and outputs work. So you're going to want to check that out if you haven't seen it already. And I talk about how we can think about data inputs and outputs and how it relates to our knowledge of working in Rhino. And so this time we're going to go a little bit more in depth into actually how to operate a component. Okay. So first of all, you might already know we have these tabs up here, and we have different categories that, like I said, we're going to talk briefly about this closer to the end of the video. And then we have these subcategories that we can go into. And then in the subcategory, we can click on a component. We can put it on our canvas, okay? Or we can double click on the canvas and type in our component, and we have a bunch of suggestions. We can also get access to components that way, okay? Now, so once we have our component on the canvas, let's talk about how to operate this thing, how to use it, okay? So first of all, we have this orange flag that might be a little bit alarming. It's not a big deal. Don't worry about it too much. We can solve this easily. Basically, what the orange flag is, I'll talk about the three different flags that we have going on here. So the orange flag is a runtime warning, okay? And if we right-click on the center, we can see our runtime warnings here. And there can be more than one, or we can click on the flag and see a runtime warning. And usually an orange runtime warning, usually a runtime warning, which is always orange, is telling us that we don't have enough data to calculate to operate the component, and not enough data to calculate or not enough data to perform anything. So we'll talk about how to put something into that component in 1 second. But let's talk about the other flags that we might run into. Okay, so we have this red flag here is a runtime error, which means that the component couldn't complete the calculation. And again, we can click on it and see our runtime error, or we can go into the menu and see the runtime errors there. Now, it's important to note that a runtime error won't perform any calculation. The calculation failed, but sometimes a component with a runtime warning will have a successful calculation. I do have some scripts where I have components with runtime warnings that in the script is working properly for several reasons. It's not necessarily good practice you should address it if possible, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's unavoidable. Okay, so just something to note. So you should address it, but sometimes the component will work properly, and it's giving you a warning for a specific reason that you may be able to ignore. Okay. Then it's not as common, but we have this gray flag, and it's actually called a runtime remark. Okay, and it's just telling us something that is important to note about the component. It's not necessarily telling us that there's any type of problem. Okay, in this case, it's telling us the sequence notation of this component. Okay, so those are the three flags that you'll run into. Okay, and since we're talking about colors and displays, So yeah, we know that if it's orange, it's a runtime warning. If it's red, it's a runtime error. If it's gray, there's no problem. If it's light gray, it's no problem, and the preview is on. And if it's dark gray, then the preview is off. And if it's faded gray, then it's not enabled. And we'll talk about that. I'll show you what all that stuff means in 1 second. Okay. So first let's talk about how we're going to get geometry into this parameter. Okay. This is the geometry parameter. Okay. So we need to get geometry into the parameter. We know that this is a point parameter. Each type of geometry has a different type of has a different parameter. And we can go in here. We can see that we have a point parameter, vector parameter, circle, plane, surface, lots of different types of parameters for different types of geometry. So if we want to use a point, we're going to use a point parameter. Okay. So there's two ways to do this. Let's do the first way. So we can go in, set one point. So we right click in the center of the component. We went set one point, and I can grab a point in Rhino. So now it's referencing a point in the Rhino model. And if we move that point around in Rhino, the Grasshopper component, the point component will follow it. It's going to follow that reference point. Okay. And that same action will happen with any of these geometry parameters. So, but that's not the only way that we can drop geometry into this component. A different way to do it is not to reference anything in the Rhino model, but we can still use the Rhino viewport to view our geometry. And the way we do that is by doing set one point, and we can go up to here in the options. It will let you click on the viewport already, or if you can't click on the viewport, you go up here, type equals point, click on that, and then actually go to coordinate. It's going to let you set up a coordinate instead of referencing a point. Okay, and now you can drop a coordinate wherever you want on the Rhino viewport. Okay, and now that we've dropped that point, this is actually internalized data. Okay, that's what we call internalized. And you'll notice that word is actually in the menu, and we'll talk about that in 1 minute. Okay, but now that we click on it, our point actually has this kind of gumball thing going on. Okay, and now we can drag this point around. And there's a few advantages to having internalized data. So this is not referencing a point in Rhino. Before we were referencing this point in Rhino. This is not referencing a point in Rhino. This is just we just have this sort of we have this coordinate that is the coordinate data that's in Grasshopper, and it's just plotting it in Rhino, and it's letting us grab onto it and move it around. So one of the advantages of this type of data, of internalized data, is that we can that the script will actually update live, and I can show you an example of that right here. Okay, let's first do let's reference a point in Rhino, and I'll show you what that looks like, and then I'll show you what it looks like when it's updating live with internalized data. Okay, so we'll set this point object. Okay, good. So our script is working. But let's see. This is an attractor point script, right? Very simple attractor point script that we're going to use in a later video. And if we move that around, it's going to update, and that's fine. But it's not updating live necessarily when I'm moving it. So it will update after I complete my transformation. But let's look at what it looks like if this data is internalized. Now we can either set one point and select a coordinate, or we can select a point already existing, and we can go to internalize data, and it's actually going to give us the exact same result as if we set a coordinate point. See, we have this gumball thing. So again, internalized data to an already existing point is going to give us the same result as setting a coordinate like we did in the last example. And you'll see now two things. You're going to see two things. Now it's updating live. Okay, it's updating the script live even before I stop moving. Also, it left behind this Rhino point. Okay, so it's not referencing this point anymore. This point has nothing to do with what's happening in Grasshopper. We can just delete that point. It has no effect. Okay, and we can still move this thing around. Okay, so again, we can clear this. We can either go in here. We can. It's already selected. We already have coordinates selected. We can either go in here and drop a coordinate. Okay. Or we can reference if it's already referencing a Rhino point, we can do it that way. Or we can take that reference point and go and internalize data. Okay. There you go. So there's kind of three different methods that you can use to set up your parameter. Okay. Now the other advantage to internalize data is that it's saved in the Grasshopper file, not in the Rhino file. What that means is a few things. If you have a simple model and you don't need to reference anything in Rhino, you can save your Grasshopper file. You don't need any reference geometry in Rhino, so you don't actually have to save your Rhino file. And that means it's also easier to send scripts to other people because you don't need to send a Rhino file accompanying it. And it's easier to store your own files. But that being said, I almost always have a Rhino file associated with it because I want to be referencing my geometry. I want to be working in Rhino sometimes and referencing geometry in Grasshopper, so I'm taking advantage of some of the workflow advantages in Rhino and some of the benefits in Grasshopper. So I want to be working on both. So I almost never have a Grasshopper file where all my geometry is internalized, but I have done it, and it's pretty practical with simple scripts. Okay, but that's a preference. That's up to you. Okay, let's talk about some of the other options in this menu. So I'll set up this curve parameter first. Let me just draw a curve here. Okay, we got to do the same thing. Set one curve. Okay, cool. And I'm going to hide this curve in Rhino. So we're only looking at it in Grasshopper, but we're still referencing that Rhino geometry. So you'll see that it's red when I'm not selecting it. It's going to turn green when I am selecting it. Okay. Actually, let's use something bigger. Let's use a surface. Okay, surface. And we'll pull up a surface parameter. Okay, cool. So see, it's red when we're not selecting it. It's green when we are when it is selected to show us what geometry this component is associated with. Okay, and we can preview it, or we can turn the preview off with this first menu icon. Okay, so now it's turned to darker gray, and that means that if this wasn't in Rhino, we wouldn't even see it at all. Okay, so it's gone. Okay, we can turn the preview back on, and we have a preview, and we can disable it. Actually, that's the next item in the menu, and that just completely disables this whole component, and there's no data coming out of this component. Okay, so no data was collected. Okay, once we turn it back on, we have our reference surface again. So what else do we have going on here? Bake is the egg. The egg is how we transfer geometry from Grasshopper back into Rhino. All right. So if we take our geometry, we do some modifications, whatever. We've moved it now, and if we bake this, the little egg, it's going to ask us what layer, and we've baked it, and we've placed that geometry back into Rhino on one of the layers, depending on which layer we chose. in the attributes menu. Okay, so that's what the little egg is. You can bake any type of geometry, any type of component. Sorry, any component with geometry, you can bake it. Okay. What else we got? Let's get rid of this. Wire display. Okay, wire display. So if we have multiple points, we have, let's get rid of this. I don't want that. If we have multiple points in our component, sorry, go to set multiple points. And okay, so if we have multiple points in our component, you can go to set multiple points, and you can plug in as many points as you want. So if we have multiple of anything in a component, that means that we have multiple lines of data. Okay, several. We have more than one list item. We have more than one items in a list. Okay, and we can see that with this wire. Okay, so that's what I wanted to bring up. We're looking at this wire display. Okay, it's a double line. So you'll notice that if there's only one geometry, then it's a single line. And if we have multiple geometry, we get this double line. Okay, and if our geometry is grafted, we actually get this dashed line. And I'm not going to get into grafting in this episode, but just something to note. That's what the dashed line means. It means we have grafted data. It means we have multiple branches and multiple lists of data. Okay, I'm going to be making more videos about that later. Okay, so what else we got here? We can disconnect from the menu. We can choose which one we will want to disconnect. Oh, wire display. I had to cover that. Almost forgot wire display. So let's look at wire display. So we have our double line wire. We've got multiple items. We can change the visibility. This is purely a visibility setting. We can go to faint, and now we have this faint wire. And if we click on it, we can see the full wire. We can even push it further and go to hidden, and we have this little Wi-Fi symbol. And when we click it, we can see the full wire. This is super useful if you have a really cluttered canvas with lots of components. If you have a complex array of components, turn some of them off. Helps clean up the appearance of your canvas, of your definition. All right. So that's what the display does. Okay. So, and I don't know if I covered this before, but you connect it. You connect your wire with the left click and drag. You disconnect it with a control drag. And if you need to connect two, you connect to one, and then you hold shift, and then you have that plus icon. You can attach as many as you want, and then you disconnect it with the control key. Okay. So good. Here we go. What else we got in here? We covered these ones. All of these are called input-output modifiers, I/O modifiers. These are going to affect the input or output data stream, and I'm going to make an entirely separate video on these settings. And so check out that other video here. Okay. And down here, we already covered set one point, set multiple points. We can also manage the point collection here. We can see our different points. It will define those points. It will give any kind of information that's necessary to describe those points. And this is applicable to any type of geometry. It will be giving different information to those geometry. We can add and delete different components of our geometry. Okay. So clear values, it's pretty obvious. It's just going to clear out that component back to kind of default without any data in it. And internalized data, we talked about that, an important thing to understand. And extract parameter, what that's doing basically is there's no point in using it for a parameter, but if we had so we can set a point for a point or any type of geometry. Usually it's going to be a plane or something in a regular component. We can do something like that. We can set up a plane like this in this component, and we can extract that parameter into a parameter component. Okay, so I'll just do that one more time. We can set if this component needs information, we can go in here, set one plane, and that's basically our input data, but it's internal, it's inside this component, so we can extract that parameter and turn it into a parameter component. Okay, so that's what that one does. And the help, and the last one in the menu is the help, which is useful if you want a bit more detail, if you want to learn how it works, or you want some more details about that component. There's a lot of really good stuff in the help portion of this menu. All right. So we covered basically these menus. They're not going to always look the same. In future videos, I'll talk about some of the differences between. There will be some differences in the menus. For a parameter, the menu looks the same no matter where you click it. But for most components, the menu does not look quite the same. We can go in the center, and we have only a few options relating to the main function of the component that we've already talked about. And if we right click on the input itself, we have also some of the other menu items that we've talked about, but we don't have all of them in one place like we do in the parameter component. Okay. So we basically covered the operation of the component. Not all of them necessarily going to be operating the same way, and I'll highlight a few of those differences, but there's really too much to cover in one video. So let's just talk about, I want to move on to different types of data streams. Okay. So we talked about the point, pretty fundamental. Points are points. We have a curve. I showed you a surface. So we have different types of geometry that that are going to exist in a data stream. So this is an example of a data stream. We have a point going to a circle, and then we can use a number slider to set up that's a different data stream. That's a number. Okay. So this is a number data stream. This is a point data stream, right, in the wire. Okay. But then we also have lots of other types of geometry. We have in here we have Boolean data, which is just true or false. It's going to either show up as true or false, or it's going to be 1 or 0. Okay. We have numbers. We have text, colors. Lots of file path. A file path is another type of data stream, not as common, but I'm just giving you the idea. I'm just showing you that there's different types of data that we're going to be using, and they're not universal. They can't be interchanged necessarily. You need to understand what data is required from the input, and we talked about that in the last video, one of the previous videos. You need to understand what data is required, and you need to understand what parameter or data input that you need to use to make that component work properly. Okay, and here's an example of an input component. This is producing the same data as this parameter. So we have a Boolean parameter and we have a Boolean input component, which is called a Boolean toggle. So if we use the Boolean parameter, we can choose to set the Boolean to true or false. We can get the same data actually from this component. It's just a different way of the only difference is going to be the user interface. Okay, so we have different ways to control the user interface. This parameter is a bit more cumbersome, but it has some function. It's also smaller, but if we want to have easier access to that parameter, we can just use the Boolean toggle. Okay, but we have lots of different examples of that. If we want to have access to numbers, we can use either a number parameter like this, sorry, number parameter like this, or we can use a number slider. We can also type in numbers into a panel, but that's not always going to be a good idea because some components won't convert this text character into a number. So it's best to stick to using a number slider or a number component. So the slider is one way to come up with an input. We have lots of different input components here that you can explore: control knob, button, digital scroller, colors, okay, graph mapper, lots of stuff that we will definitely get into in later episodes. Okay, the panel, something that I use often. We can put text in here. We can put numbers in here. We can put characters in here, depending on what we need it for. We can use this as an input, but we can also use it as an output, like I showed you here. We can see the output data in this panel, or we can use this to define a data input for another component. Okay. So again, for a panel, the easiest way to do that is to double click and hit the quotation mark. And then you'll open up a panel. You can either start typing like this. You can hit the quotation mark and start typing, or you can just hit a quotation mark and open it up like that, okay? So those are the basic kind of different types of data streams. There are, obviously, I only touched on the basic types of data streams and input parameters and input components. Let's just take a look at some other types of components that we'll come across. Actually, there are a few more data streams that we haven't really talked about, types of data that we haven't really talked about. This is an example here. We have construct domain. So a domain is a data type that you're going to want to be familiar with for a lot of different types of designs. We have some, and I'm going to talk about the domain. Actually, I'll talk about the domain right now. So let's talk about, I have this script here that's going to it'll be an example to show a domain, what a domain is, an introduction to domains. We'll talk a little bit about some Boolean operators. Okay, so let's put together this little script that I made here. So I have these circles made up with this script, and with this populate 2D. Okay, so what do we got here? We have this outline, this curve. We have this populate 2D component placing some points. Again, I'm just doing an overview, so I'm not really going in depth here. We're definitely going to talk about these concepts in other videos, but I'll just briefly explain what's going on here so you can understand some different types of data. All right. So we have these populate 2D. We have these points. I'm going to turn that preview off. Here's a domain. Okay. So this is a good example. So we have these points acting as the plane for the circle. So each circle is being placed at each one of these points. All right. And we have to define also the radius of these circles. And I wanted to create a bunch of randomly sized circles, but random is not definitive enough. We have to define a range of random numbers. So that's what this is. It's a range. And you can see that little hexagon there. It's showing us that we need a domain to create that range. So we're going to use construct domain, and we have these number sliders going in 1 to 10. So that's why our domain is 1 to 10, okay? And that means that our random numbers are going to range from a radius of 1 to a radius of 10, okay? And if we change that, then our max is 5, or our minimum is 1, our maximum is 5. You know, you get the deal. I know you get what's going on, okay? And but let's say, so that's what a domain, that's an example of a domain, okay? Definitely going to talk more about that in other videos. Let's say, so here's an example of using Booleans, using a Boolean operator. And this is you know, this is a math component, and we're doing a test. We're doing a test with numbers. And we're going to get some Boolean operators. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is just to show that there's some components that are only using Boolean operators. Okay, and I just want you to be aware of different types of mathematical concepts that we're going to be using. So here's an example. You know, let's say we already had this plot of circles in Rhino, and we want to select only a certain size of the circles. We only want to select a range of sizes. We don't want anything larger than a certain size, and we don't want anything smaller than a certain size. Okay, so what we could do is set up this larger than and smaller than component. So I'm going to plug this radius into here, and which one does it go to? Yeah, this one's here, and then this one's here. So radius is larger than 1 and smaller than 5. Okay, and so what we're gonna do is now we have a test of testing each one of these circles, whether it's larger than and smaller than these two numbers, and we're gonna plug this into a gate and component. So we actually have two Boolean operators going into one component. So we're doing a test. We're basically testing it twice. Okay, and watch what happens if we preview what's coming out of here. Oops, did that wrong. Plug that into there. Okay, check this out. I have it previewed in white so you can really see what's going on. And what you can see is we're filtering out all the components except the ones that are between 7 and 8, or whatever we have these numbers at. Okay. All right. So I know this is a little bit specific, but I'm just showing you that you might need to kind of get into like how to use Boolean operators and that type of thing if you want to achieve some really interesting stuff in Grasshopper. Okay. So here's another example. This is actually an example of list management. This is call pattern. Okay. We're taking a list and then we're culling, which culling is basically meaning deleting. We're deleting certain points, certain items of the list depending on the Boolean values. Okay. Okay, let's keep going. Let's take a look at some other components. So we basically touched on some of the mathematical components, like in this category, we have the domains, we have the operators, like simple mathematic operators, and then we have some of our Boolean operators. We have other things like polynomials, scripting, trigonometry. Okay. In the sets category, we have different ways to manage data. Okay, a list item will take an item out of a list depending on which index we use. We have, we already showed you the call pattern component. Okay, we have, we can manipulate text data streams, and we also have kind of more complex components for tree management, data tree management. Okay, which we will talk about in one of the next videos. I'll give you a quick example of something like that. This is a clean tree, which comes out of here, clean tree. This is an example where we're taking a complex data stream. Well, it's not that complex. And we're using clean tree to actually remove certain branches. We have this data stream with empty branches. Okay, we're using clean tree to actually remove any empty branches. All right. Anyways, let's get back on topic. So different ways to manage data is basically the summary here. The next category, we have vectors. In the vectors category, you already saw populate 2D, where we populated this rectangle with points. We can create planes. Okay, create different planes with lots of different components for planes. Those are very important. Create points. We can use and modify vectors for different translation components. Translation components is just one example, but we use vectors for a lot of different things. Okay. The next category is curve, and so we have some primitive geometry that you're familiar with, like circles and rectangles, polygons, lines. We also have splines, spline geometry, which is like control point curves, NURBS curves, and stuff like that. Different curve modification components, and then we have some other components for analyzing curves that we'll definitely get into. Okay. The next one is the next category is surface. So we're looking at again, we have a bit of a similar thing here as with curve. We have some primitive geometry, some more complex geometry, and some analysis tools for analyzing geometry, and then some other components in here for modifying geometry. Okay, some similar things going on in the mesh category. We have primitive meshes. Okay, we have the ability to create a mesh from a brep. We have analysis tools for deconstructing meshes and evaluating mesh edges and such. Okay. The intersect category is any type of intersection between different types of geometry. We have things like intersection between curves, between breps, between curves and breps, surface and curved. You can go through this. Lots of different types of intersections, and some trimming tools. You'll see that these solid components are similar to what we would call in Rhino our Boolean commands, like Boolean difference, Boolean split. That's what these are doing. Okay, and these are similar to the split components for surfaces. And the transform, these are a lot of familiar, I think you'll see a lot of familiar components in here, like the array tools and some simple transformations like move, mirror, and rotate. Obviously, these get used a lot. And we have some more complex transformation tools like sporf. That's a fun one. Sporf, twist. Okay. And the last native category to Grasshopper is the display category. And the main things that are going on here is like custom preview. That's an important one, where you can change the color of your preview or other properties to your preview. That's how I made these white. What I actually used to do this is I used custom preview line weights, which is actually a component in Human, not native to Grasshopper, but I just want to throw that out there because it's really useful. You can change the color, and you can actually change the line weight of the component of the objects, the geometry. Okay. Some other things that we can display is like a quick graph where you can graph your data. You wouldn't necessarily graph this, but I'll show you what that looks like if we're graphing the diameter of these circles, something like that. We wouldn't really do that, but you'll see an example of a quick graph in one of the future videos. The other thing that we can use, the other really helpful thing to display is a vector display, because a vector does not show up in Grasshopper automatically unless we use a vector display. And a perfect example of this, or one example of this is right here in this model, where we're creating this curve with a definition, and when we change our vector lengths, we can see a preview of what those vectors look like with this vector preview component, and we can see how that's affecting our curve. Okay, what does this thing look like? I'll turn this on for you guys if you're interested. I have this interesting vase thing for a workshop that I'm running. Okay. Anyways. Okay, so we covered, just to come back, summarize this thing. We covered basically how we can get data into our components. We talked about the different menu items. We talked about internalizing data. We talked about different types of data streams, geometry, Boolean values, colors, numbers, different types of data streams. We also talked about these warning flags, okay? And we talked about some of the wire display properties, and then we just went through the different categories and kind of reviewed the general, main components to be considering, okay? So I hope that was helpful as a introduction. Let me know what you guys think. In the next episode, we're gonna talk about groups and clusters and user objects and other ways that other things that we can use to be a bit more efficient, especially with keeping our canvas legible, not too cluttered, and also with navigating the viewport, or navigating the canvas, I should say. Okay, so that's in the next episode. So I hope you learned something from this episode, and I'll see you guys in the next one.